Exactly, right in the middle.
Alrighty, well that 5-minute warning was a lot shorter than I thought it was going to be, which is awesome. So going to keep rolling here. Last couple of panels for the SPAC conference coming up. We'd like to introduce our next panel, our 6 panelists here, talking about the regulatory and governance landscape in the SPAC world. Introducing Chaz Churchwell from Churchwell Insurance Agency, Matthew Gray from Elinoff Grossman & Schul, Stephen Crate from Crate & Chu, Alex Wenninger from McGuire Woods, Michael Lockwood from Maples Group, and Balaji from DataTrack Services. Give them a round of applause and let's get going here.
So for everybody who is still here to listen to our panel, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. My name is Steve Crate. I'm lucky enough to be moderating this great panel and hopefully with some interesting conversation. I'm the managing partner of Crate & Chu. We're an accounting firm that specializes in PCAOB audits, helping both domestic and international companies go public here in the United States. If you could introduce yourself.
Alex Wenninger-Arajo. I am a securities and capital markets partner at McGuire Woods. I have been working on SPACs for longer than I'd like to admit, but it's been a long time. I have had prior stints at 2 really great firms, Loeb & Loeb and then EGS, where my colleague Matt Gray here works today. And yeah, excited to be here.
Hello, everyone. Matthew Gray, Elinoff Grossman & Schul, co-head of the M&A practice at EGS. You've probably heard of our firm a couple of times today. We're kind of plastered on a couple of things. I've been at EGS now for 13 years doing SPACs, involved in a lot of the early iterations, developing a lot of the common practices and processes used today. Prior to that, I was at some large, well-known international firms for another dozen years before that, and was originally an accountant prior to being a lawyer. So,
Good afternoon, Michael Lockwood, corporate partner with Maples and Calder in the Cayman Islands. I've been doing SPACs since 2013, since my entire life as a lawyer. So you can say that I've grown up with them in many different ways. Maples is a law firm as well as a fiduciary services provider, and we have 19 offices across the world in all the major time zones. And in terms of the laws that we practice, we are Cayman Islands law, British Virgin Islands, Ireland, Jersey, and Luxembourg.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Chaz Churchwell with Churchwell Insurance Agency. I'm also the host of the DSPAC podcast, and I am chairman and COO of 1776 Acquisition Corporation. So you'll find that I am sold out in the SPAC ecosystem in a few different ways. With Churchwell Insurance Agency, we're a boutique insurance agency, veteran-owned, founded in 2014, really based on the principle of we know that whenever you're with a big shop, the reality is that they have investors, and there's a lot of hands in the cookie jar, and they're beholden to their investors. And it didn't feel right to me. So I launched Churchwell Insurance Agency with the heartbeat of saying, we want to do things the right way for the client. And we want to take times, do it with excellence, and really just love and protect on them. You'll find that I'm a D&O specialist for SPAC, DSPAC, and public companies with a market cap sub 1 billion. So from there, I will pass it to my brother down here.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Balaji here from DataTrack. SEC filing agents, financial printers. We've been around for 21 years doing this. We help SPAC companies right from SPAC, DSPAC, and beyond. That's what we do, and I'm here to share our expertise with the panel here. Yeah, enjoy, everyone. All right, great. Let's just jump right in. I've tried to organize this by topics as best I can, so we'll start off talking a little bit about DSPACs, DSPAC transactions, excuse me. Alex, under the SEC rules, target companies are now considered co-registrants in the registration statement, which creates a big change in liability. How are you advising founders and management teams to prepare for this shift before they sign the LOI?
Sure. So as a very quick primer on this, right, prior to 2024, the it was only the SPAC, and by virtue of that, the SPAC's management team that had to sign the registration statement when it came to doing a de-SPAC transaction, so an S4 and F4. Under the current regulatory regime, now the target company appears as a co-registrant, and by virtue of that, the target company's management team also appears. So, of course, the same liability provisions that apply to the SPAC's management team now apply to the target company. So we like to take a four-pronged approach when we're advising target companies on how to approach this. Number one is really a shift in the mindset, right, from what was seen before as really like a sell-side M&A transaction, right, where the target company was just seeing that as their role in this, to really being a public company readiness exercise, right, where, target companies need to be prepared, target company management teams need to be prepared to think that way because of the disclosures that they have to prepare. Second thing is for them to have, a view to what I would call projection discipline. And that is that no longer are they able to, just throw out lofty projections into the registration statement. They actually have to have documented foundation for those projections, right? The third thing that we advise them to do is to really take an assessment of their D&O policies when it comes to covering the directors and officers who are going to be signing the registration statement, and also to ensure that coverage is appropriate, number one, and then number two, to also take a look at the indemnity agreements that are in place to ensure that they have the appropriate coverage there as well. And then the last point is really not specific to what I would say the change in the regulatory regime, but I think is absolutely key, which is ensuring that the target company does an assessment of its accounting, its audit capabilities to ensure that day one, once the ticker symbol changes, they're ready to actually be a public company and take on those responsibilities moving forward.
Thanks, Alex. So that was great on the company side, on the target side, but Matthew, how are you seeing the SPAC boards focus more on managing the deal litigation risk in a de-SPAC transaction?
Sure. I guess to start off, one of the things to note, most of the SPACs, as a result of the U.S. IRS rules that they came out with in terms of excise taxes, have moved to Cayman Islands, and also certainly a couple of questionable Delaware cases that concern people. So most of the SPACs have moved to Cayman, which has different rules, and Michael can certainly talk a bit about that. But that doesn't necessarily mean the boards are not, aren't at risk if they don't follow proper procedure, if they don't do their job right, if there are problems. They're still subject to liability, cases brought in the U.S. for violation of securities laws, as well as, even a fiduciary claim may ultimately get heard by a Delaware court if it's in conjunction with a securities law claim. So they do have to really do proper protection and prevention and plan. I think the most simplest way to do it for boards is just keep in mind that this is a real public company. You need to do your job properly. You need to take it seriously. You're not there just to show up right before they approve a deal and punch in. You need to be involved. You need to have regular meetings of the board. The board should be fully informed in terms of what's going on. When if there's an LOI, historically there wasn't necessarily a legal requirement for the board to approve it unless unless the SPAC was agreeing to significant exclusivity or other significant liabilities. But quite frankly, we generally recommend that the SPAC boards approve LOIs, if not in advance, certainly shortly thereafter. Meet with the management team and make sure they fully understand it. And a key part of it as well is to really understand the transaction and what's going on in the transaction. From the beginning, understand the business case, understand the diligence that's happening, understand the deal terms, and document all of these meetings that you're having. Have formal meetings. Don't just have the direct, the management CEO call each of the board members individually and tell them what's going on. I can't tell you how many times we talk to management teams and they say, oh, we told the directors what's going on. That's nice, but that doesn't help in a lawsuit when they say, show us the board minutes showing that you had meetings and talked about it. So it's important to properly really document the entire process, to document the board's involvement, particularly the independent directors, in the decisions that are being made. Besides everything else, the board also needs to be fully aware of conflict issues. To the extent that their board or any member of management has a significant conflict with the target, it doesn't even have to be that significant, just any stock ownership, any special agreements they have, it should be fully disclosed to the board, and processes should be set up to essentially isolate them from that process and address those conflicts early on. The later you wait to get that done, the less courts will consider it as a proper process. And you expose the board to significant risk by not setting up the processes early on. So.
Great, thanks, Matthew. These are all great points related to protecting the different constituencies of these transactions. But for those companies that did not hire any of these great attorneys on the panel, Chaz, what should SPAC boards know about the long tail of fiduciary duty exposure?
Oh, wow. So the long tail of fiduciary exposure. So here's really where I think a lot of things get twisted. So whenever you're looking at the tail for, and you have two sides to it, right? You have the SPAC and the de-SPAC side. So it's kind of a two-pronged issue. But first of all, a lot of times, SPAC teams, if you're here, you're like, hey, the deal is done, let's celebrate, pop the cork, everybody gets a new watch, like you're fired up, you got the deal done. And that's worthy of celebrating, but the problem is that a lot of times people think, okay, we're good, we're done. You know that there's a tail policy that you need to pick up, but a lot of times you don't really even understand why. You don't understand what the statute of limitations is connected to it. On the target, it's really when should they be picking up the coverage and all these other different nuances. And so I would say first on the SPAC side, there's two paths forward. Do we grab our 6-year tail policy, or do we ride the coattails as an additional insured on the target's D&O? And then I would really say you want to make sure that you believe this company is going to be around and is not going to be faltering and crumbling and 3 years down the road failing. Because here's what's going to happen. If they can't pay their own D&O insurance in 3 years, they're not paying yours. So that's one thing to think about if you're going to ride their coattails. But if you're going to do the 6-year policy, then that is wonderful, right? But then you also have this other issue that you have to contend with, which is what's really the statute of limitations. So these guys will tell you it's about 5 years. But then if let's say that 4 years down the line something gets discovered, then there's like this magical 2-year extension that comes into play, which is really kind of where that 6 years could fall in, and it could even go more than that. And so basically, you want to realize that for the first 3 years is where we typically see the majority of your risk. But after 3 years, it doesn't mean that it goes away. I have a client right now that's in litigation, and they've been named the part of the target, and they brought in somebody from the SPAC and made them CEO. But what you'll find is that guy who's now CEO, he's been listed on both sides of the deal. So they actually, unfortunately, were with a company that, an insurance agency that did not have them give notice to their SPAC tail and only gave notice to one side. And so it ended up becoming a very precarious situation. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the long tail. Things can delay for multiple years before stuff comes out, and then they ultimately end up naming the SPAC in litigation. But then further to that point, you go back to the target. A lot of times, if you're a private company that's here and you're looking at going public and you're considering a SPAC to do it, or you're looking at an IPO to do it, if you're going to have filings that are out there, you should have private D&O in place. Because here's what you will find. Let's say that you have your S4 that goes out, your proxy goes out, or let's say you ultimately decide, oh, we think we can do the IPO, we're going to go that way. You drop your S1. If you do not have D&O in place, all of those statements are not covered by your D&O insurance if you didn't pick up coverage until you were publicly traded. It is a misnomer and it's an assumption all the time that we see that these private companies just assume that, oh, we'll get D&O when we're public and then we're good. No, you need to have, there's something called a pending and prior date. You want to make sure, because things that you say even before you're public can come back to bite you, and then D&O will not be there to advocate and fill in the gap for you, and it'll just be an attack on your balance sheet.
Thanks, Chaz.
Yeah.
Thank you. Balaji, beyond the legal fees and the auditor fees, what's the real business cost of an SEC comment letter on a de-SPAC transaction, and how often is it actually preventable?
Yeah, SEC comment letter is not an easy one, right? So the first frustration is it's going to prolong the deal. It's going to take a lot of time, a lot of frustrations. That's number one, which you don't want to have. The second is there's a management distraction that's happening, and they are focused on few areas, and that things go out of schedule. So that's a management distraction is another effect of the SEC comment letters. The third is I'd say there's an investor confidence. It's very important, right? So the investors coming in, and then you get an SEC comment letter, and the investor confidence takes a beating. So that's a huge cost for SPAC companies to have. Right. Finally, and most important one is if the comment letter involves the accounting interpretations, that is going to be a serious one. And what this means is, especially for smaller companies, it might quite often result in restatement of your financial statements. So that is a big thing. And if you're doing that in the very first year, and that drags the investor confidence, management distractions, and whatnot. So these are the common symptoms, and it's very important that you get things right the first time, and not leave it for SEC to scrutinize and come back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Balaji. We completely agree. As auditors, we do not like accounting comments in the comment letters. We do try to avoid that.
Right.
I'm gonna shift focus a little bit to talk about international. And I think the last panel might have been before, was talking about how many sponsors are now moving to Cayman, and more sponsors are moving to Cayman. Michael, is this partly driven by a lower perceived litigation risk?
It's great that I can now answer after Matthew, because he set me up really well for helping me, at least on the Delaware side, because I was going to fumble through that. The Cayman Islands has been an international jurisdiction in terms of financial services since the 1960s, and so since then we've been able to establish ourselves as a stable and flexible jurisdiction where everyone has gotten to know us, everyone's gotten familiar with the structures, and that started in the investment funds and has now also been seen a lot with the IPO issuers, and then also now SPACs, more so now than ever. And that's been really helpful because, excuse me, sorry, losing my train of thought. A little bit nervous. Being a tax-neutral jurisdiction, it just helps in terms of structuring the deals so that if you have an international target, then it would make sense for the Cayman company to remain in Cayman and remain public. If you're going to domesticate, and because it's a U.S. business and it makes sense to go back to Delaware, it's the easiest thing in the world to move from Cayman to Delaware, and so that's been really helpful just in terms of making it as easy and flexible as possible for people to actually do the business that they want to do without any increased hurdles and burdens.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to add one comment. My understanding is, Cayman Islands does not have a big plaintiffs bar, which certainly helps. They do have the loser pays legal fees structure, so you tend to get less frivolous claims brought. People looking just to get a settlement and get something out of it. So that's my understanding of one advantage that Cayman certainly has. So.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen.
Exactly.
Thank you. Balaji, how different is the SEC filing experience for a foreign company entering a SPAC transaction compared to a domestic one?
Yeah, so the obvious one is the form. So the domestic has the S1s and S4s, and the foreign companies have the F1 and the F4s. That's primarily the difference. And the other difference is definitely on the accounting standards that is involved. The domestic ones are definitely the US GAAP accounting standards, and the foreign companies, most of them follow IFRS, but you're allowed to use US GAAP as their accounting standards. So that's the key difference, number one. The other differences are there is there's something called a cross-border task force that the SEC introduced. Yeah, that happened a couple of years back, and they are really into foreign issuers' scrutinization of the filings. So what they do is they look into, I mean, there's no more light touch that used to be in the past. So there is really some scrutinization happening. So this task force is assigned. We've been seeing increase in the scrutiny levels and in the comment letters being received. So it's very important that the foreign issuers focus on the compliance part and not take it lightly like in the past. So things have changed. It's very important that you look at, and also the SEC has given a sample comment letter on the frequently committed issues especially to the foreign filers. So if you go through them, you will probably cover the top 10 mistakes that foreign filers will have made. So it's very important that you go through and also you engage with partners and who advise you on how to avoid them. So that's definitely the key difference. Earlier, it used to be very easy, light touch by the SEC. It's gotten a little different. And I would say, yeah, as part of the task force, they go after the gatekeepers as well, the auditors, underwriters, printers. Yeah, they're also being pulled up for any issues. So yeah, that's a key difference. So it's not a light touch anymore. It is being scrutinized at par with the domestic filing companies.
Great.
If I could just kind of restate that in one way, the way you were just talking, because it's so important. The SEC's new cross-border task force is not just an SEC thing. It's actually an interagency thing to where they're working with other agencies collaboratively. And if you're taking money from certain companies, or there's the potential they think that you're taking money from certain companies, if you're international, they're taking a deeper dive into everything, which is going to slow it down exponentially. But further to his point, is you are in better footing if you are using U.S. service providers than if you're using your international service providers. You may feel more comfortable using someone in Singapore, HK, whatever, but the reality is that all you're doing is increasing the intensity of scrutiny and the delays that you're going to have to deal with. Whereas if you're using U.S. service providers, you're actually reducing the friction that you're going to have to endure from SEC and subsequently from any of the NASDAQ or NYSE review that's coming through.
Great. Thanks, Chaz. Michael, I have another Cayman question for you. In connection with board independence and governance arrangements, what are the Cayman legal factors that need to be considered when using a Cayman issuer?
You should ask the U.S. guys first, because then they can at least set me up so I can only talk about that stuff. But it's not entirely dissimilar to what you would be used to with a Delaware corporation in terms of structure. We have boards of directors that can set up committees. Our laws do not have any stringent requirements in terms of what those committees need to do, how they need to operate, how the directors need to manage the business of the company. And so it's very flexible in that sense, because we can just take the charter or a document used commonly for Delaware listed companies and just Caymanize it a little bit so that it works with the Cayman company. And as long as it's in line with the director's duties that they owe to the company, then you're going to be off to the races. So that's been. But the board should also remember that they are ultimately responsible for any actions taken by any of the committees that they've delegated to. And as Matthew mentioned earlier, the very important thing that the directors need to think about when they get that business combination and that LOI is this a conflicted transaction? Is there something I need to say? Because Cayman law does allow you, as a director, to vote on a conflicted transaction provided that you give disclosure. However, that does not override the core duty to act in the company's best interests in terms of approving the deal. And so if your conflict is one that you cannot discharge both sets of duties, then it's going to be advisable for that director to either recuse themselves or for the board to set up a special committee in order to manage the conflict and ensure that the best decision is being reached and that all of the information is being reviewed. And you can, of course, get your reports, you can get your valuations, you can talk to the officers and the management and the sponsor, but ultimately the directors are the ones who are making that final decision. And they need to be sure that when they hand on heart say that this is in the best interest of the company, that they have challenged every assumption, they've asked questions, and again, properly documented this, because the Cayman court would never challenge the commercial decision made. They would look as to how the board arrived at this decision, and they would want to say, okay, did you guys see that this was potentially a problem before the business combination? Where is it in the board minutes? Did you ask the questions, et cetera, et cetera?
And just to note, in Delaware and most U.S.-related jurisdictions, the focus is heavily on process. If a director's conflicted, they really should be sidelined in the process. They can certainly, talk, as well as management, they can certainly talk to the board, inform the board, but they should not be involved in the key decision-making. They should not be involved in the actual negotiations. The perfect example would be not only the negotiations of the deal that's ongoing, but other alternative transactions. Because if a SPAC's looking at two targets, the one, say the director has, owns a majority of one of the companies, is uninvolved in the other one, that director, whether or not they mean to and whether or not they actually intend to, could take actions that could be interpreted by plaintiffs' lawyers and by a court as having tainted the other transaction. They intentionally ruined the other transaction, so the SPAC was only left with their transaction. So it's important to set up these procedures early on before things have already got far into a transaction.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. So Alex, we've been talking a lot about international companies, international SPACs, but are there any unique challenges, any unique governance challenges when you have a US-listed SPAC, but they're targeting an international company?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when a U.S.-listed SPAC is going out and looking for a non-U.S. target company, right, really what you have is a situation where the SPAC team is marrying an accelerated U.S. public company timeline with a foreign and often quite deep-rooted corporate regime of a foreign jurisdiction. So we see three key challenges there. The first is really when it comes to disclosure, right, the ever-present disclosure gap. Often these companies are operating in jurisdictions that, frankly, it's a lower standard, it's a much less stringent regulatory regime, and it's a little bit of a challenge, right, to make sure that disclosures are brought up to the standard necessary to, subject themselves to SEC scrutiny and ultimately get a deal, worked through. The second challenge is what I would just call FPI status, right? Oftentimes, right, the goal of these non-U.S. target companies is to come out of the de-SPAC transaction as foreign private issuers, right? To them, that's a big win because there's a much lower regulatory burden that's placed on them, right? They have a lot fewer SEC filings that they have to comply with. Oftentimes, they can follow home country rules, so on and so forth. But when it comes to a much longer term view, right, ultimately, particularly your U.S. investors are going to be expecting to have the higher quality disclosures anyways, even though they may not have the obligation to do that. And from a practical perspective, what that ultimately translates to is when it comes to doing additional financings, whether it be additional pipes, follow-on offerings, it can become a little bit more of a challenge, right, for these companies to execute on those, additional transactions. The last thing I'd like to highlight that's a challenge is where where the board sits in all of this, right? Because the board ultimately sits in a very difficult place where they see themselves having to navigate a multi-jurisdictional challenge, right? Number one, they have to, look to what the requirements are going to be from a U.S. perspective, SEC requirements, the exchanges, so on and so forth, and yet they still have the challenges of the home country laws, right, where the company operates as well. And in the mix of all of that, right? Oftentimes when it comes to making decisions on moving forward with a transaction, not. A lot of those challenges, there's a tremendous interplay and conflicting interests, particularly when it comes to the sponsors wanting to execute because they want value coming out of their promote. So.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Matthew, I'm going to just ask you about projections. How should the transaction parties deal with the projections in a de-SPAC transaction?
I will say I'd say some of the focus on projections has calmed down since the SEC backed off their original proposed rules that they came out with, which was forcing underwriter liability on any financial advisors involved in a transaction. The banks were panicking. There was a lot of focus on trying not to include projections at all. But in the end, projections are somewhat necessary in some deals. You have to, for a couple of reasons. One, from the perspective of the SPAC and the board, they have to do proper diligence and understand this company. And if projections are material to being able to understand this company, they can't just ignore projections. They're essentially, it's kind of a catch-22, because obviously to the extent the management gets projections, they do have to disclose it. But they can't just put their head in the sand and say, I don't want to get projections, because then there may be questions and expose themselves to liability for not looking at things they should have looked at. So I think it's more, it was more common to see them for that reason, as well as, for determining the valuation. It's a key part of it. Fairness opinion providers typically do require it, as well as, in the end, you have to sell this deal to the market, and it's part of the story. If you can't tell the story without really explaining, without giving some sort of projections, it's hard to get a deal done. So in the end, you have to live with the risk that the projections may be off, but the key there is, one, the management team, from the SPAC perspective, should be doing diligence on the projections. They should be sitting down with the management team of the company, really understanding what's in the projections, how they got there, what are the key assumptions, how realistic is it? If it's unrealistic, work with the team to revise the projections, get them to a more realistic, conservative projections. Quite frankly, for the company, it also looks better to come up with more conservative projections. As people talked about earlier, you're much better off setting low expectations and beating them when you're public than promising the world and completely falling flat, for both momentum for the company as well as for liability. Beyond that, it's important that you disclose the details of those projections when you disclose it publicly, and if the management team receives it, they're required to disclose it. Previously, there was a requirement that that only had to be disclosed if the board relied upon it. The SEC changes the other year, revised it, so the board basically has to disclose it if the management or the board receives the projection. So that was one change, unfortunately. But it has to be disclosed there. It may be disclosed in an investor deck. But the key is really let the public know where these projections came from. It's not just pie in the sky. It's not, and we were seeing this a number of years back during the boom, where some of these, for example, electric car company would say, there's going to be a $10 trillion electric car company market in total, and so in 5 years, I'm going to be worth $10 trillion, without at all making any sense. You got to explain how you came up with this number. What are the key assumptions? What's the growth? What's the expenses? What projections? What went into all these projections? What assumptions about the market, cost of capital, everything involved. If you give that level of disclosure, in the end, that helps protect the board as well as the company. It helps protect everyone that you've given the explanation of how you got there, the roadmap. And if you don't get there, you can point to the public to say, I told you how we would get there if we get there. This is what went wrong, so we didn't get there. So I think that's kind of an important factor, is really, you can't avoid them in most deals. You have to deal with them. And one final point on projections, not only should it be conservative and realistic, but it also shouldn't be too far out. I mean, you got to have a reasonable time frame. You shouldn't be going out, 10, 20 years of projections. 2-3 years is kind of a reasonable time frame. And you really shouldn't be going too much beyond that. So
Stop making sense, Matthew. Stop it. Stop it. I can't handle it.
just trying to do my job.
I like the point about under-promising and over-delivering. That's something I tell my teams all the time as well. Chaz, I think we have time for one more question. Is the SEC shifting towards individual accountability, and what does that mean for D&O insurance?
Ooh, okay, so yeah, you may or may not know this. So obviously, whenever the Biden administration was in place, SEC functioned very differently, right, than it does now. So during the Biden administration, it was all about blockbuster fines. How big can we get it? How much money can we rake in on these civil penalties? And now we find ourselves in a very different environment under a Paul Atkins SEC, right, in a lot of different ways. So what you'll find is that Paul Atkins has instructed his team to take an approach of saying, we don't want to punish shareholders. That's who we're supposed to protect as the SEC. If we're doing blockbuster fines, how are these guys paying for it? They're leveraging, they're diluting, and so the stock price goes down, and that adversely impacts the shareholder, right? So their approach is, we're going to target the individuals responsible. Us, in this room. They're going to target us individually. And here's where that becomes remarkably frightening for me. You will find that in most cases, in fact, right now, fiscal year 2025, and I know we're just over, but I'll wrap this. In fiscal year 2025, out of individual fines and penalties that were handed out, I think it was 2/3 of the time, the company was precluded from indemnifying the individual. And what you'll find is that if you look in your D&O program, you've got your coverage for your legal defense to protect you there. But in a lot of cases, you will find in your policy wording that civil penalties are precluded from being paid out. So to Matt's point, when he's saying, start reading your minutes, start actually paying attention to what's going on. If there's material conflict, put it in your minutes. Have a paper trail. In fact, I'll tell you that the number one plaintiff fact pattern for coming after all of us whenever something goes sideways is because of the fact that you don't manage conflict and disclose conflict properly. You have to do that. If there's issues on what your model looks like and your projections, minutes. It's got to be in there. Hey, we worked through it. This guy was saying this guy was saying that, this gal was saying that. Disclose where you're talking about and where everything was. Because when you can say, we worked through the hard conversation and we arrived here because of this, and this, then you're able to say we weren't being haphazard. We weren't being cavalier. We know that there was going to be some redemptions, but ... We knew that we had these projections, ... Shareholders were aware, and we knew that there could be these potential risk components, and we made sure that we worked through all of that, ... It has to be documented. And so I would tell you guys, I know director after director after director that they go, if you talk to them about something and then you kind of press them on it, they're like, yeah, and you press them on it, they're like, man, honestly, I didn't even read that thing. I just signed that freaking thing and just pushed it on through. I just docu-signed it. Why? It's your tail on the line, and under an Atkins administration, individually, the game is leveled up. So I just want to make sure that you guys are truly aware of that.
All right. Thank you, Chaz. Want to thank all our panelists. This was a great panel. I know I learned a lot, so really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Brother.
Thank you for hosting.
My pleasure.
Thank you, boys, for helping me out there.
No problem.